Very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to yet another uLaw webinar. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about law office or legal office expense management, fundamentally focusing on the two main areas of expenses, managing your client and your business expenses. Today's webinar is not accredited for CPD hours, but again, it's going to be another fun-filled session. We're going to leave a lot of time at the end for questions, and this particular topic was suggested by, again, the user group that we had started for suggestions about newer topics that we can cover when it's not necessarily a CPD. So this was a session that was suggested by many of our clients, and we're happy to present this webinar today. As all uLaw webinars do have, so is their agenda for today's session. So we're going to be talking about business and client expenses and the terms of disbursements and how that differs from your business or office expense, and the variety of differences in terms of how you manage it, how you track it, and how you report it. So this is three major components and the obligations that you have between those two. Okay, and the importance really of managing and tracking and reporting these expenses are something that we're going to be talking as well. So individually, we'll cover what disbursements are, and many of you probably already know. You've been to a few of our sessions. You probably use uLaw. You use some other kind of legal accounting software. But regardless, we want to talk about the key takeaways of being the benefits of why you need to manage disbursements. Is there a better way of managing disbursements? Really depending on your personality. If you're someone who can manage and maintain each and every transaction and you're very methodical in how you go about your day-to-day life, then maybe there's a certain path. But if you are the kind of person who needs to focus more on legal work and accounting and tracking of expenses and those are the types of things that you traditionally are not comfortable doing, you maybe procrastinate in following up or recording, and then maybe there's a slightly better way that you can handle those disbursements because you're going to wanting to manage them anyway. Types of general disbursements. We're going to talk about the various different types in general and between trust and general, and what are the expectations with regards to the Law Society. Now, this was a topic that we covered as a CPD called Disbursements Demystified, so I'm not going to cover too much. We just did that last week. I'm going to touch upon disbursements, but I'm going to fundamentally focus on the business accounting as well, and then show you the differences between these two types of expenses, and walk you through how uLaw, as a legal accounting software, manages both these expenses in a very subliminal, ease-of-use way, allowing you to report the ones that need to be reported, as well as tracking and driving analytics on the expenses that you need to manage for your business. We're going to talk about what is an expense book, and as I said, what types of analytics can you generate out of uLaw. And talking about business office expenses, we've given a list of types of expenses that you may come across on a day-to-day basis as you being a solo practitioner or maybe a small legal firm. As long as you're running a business, you know that these are the types of expenses that you come across, be it office expenses, printing stationery, could be a rent, could be the corporate tax, even interest and bank charges that you pay banks, and much more. Okay? So let us start today's conversation or webinar about what is a disbursement, kind of the definitions as per Wiki, a layman term, and maybe in terms of accounting terms. So quickly, what is a disbursement? It's the act of paying out or dispersing money, such as money paid out to run a business, cash expenditures, and you can read this in Wiki, and we're going to make this presentation available. But in a layman's term, it's basically expenses incurred for your client by your law office with the hope that through a proper retainer agreement or some form of a contract that these are recoverable expenses. So there's leap of faith. Beyond leap of faith, there's also a contract, hopefully, that's obligating your client to pay you for these disbursements. Now, these disbursements could be paid directly out of trust if this is something you manage in terms of trust money, or if you're going to be doing it out of general, then obviously you would have to pay up front and then recover that through an invoice that you generate. Okay, so really, disbursement is nothing but an expense that's incurred for your client by your legal or law office with the hope of recovering those expenses. And in accounting terms, the bottom line is you need to record it in the books and balance them when you spend invoice and recover that expense. Okay, so very simple. Just keep in mind that a disbursement is nothing but an expense that's incurred for your client by your office. And we're going to talk about what is a business expense. Okay, so the disbursement was an expense that's done for your client by your law office, and then a business expense obviously is the expense that you spend for your law office itself. Okay, so an expense is the act of paying out money, again, in terms to run a business, like rent, buying a computer, office furniture, so everything that goes around running a business. And this is something that you probably pay out of a loan, you pay out of your credit card, you pay out of your cash, pay out of your owner's pocket. We're not going to get into that. We're just going to define what that means. So in a layman's term, we want to define this as expenses incurred for keeping the lights on in your legal office or your law office. But when it comes to accounting, you're going to notice the definition is almost the same, that you need to record it in the books so that it's balanced. Okay? So that's, in terms of an accounting aspect to both these expenses, they remain the same, that there is a need for you to record it. In terms of just the layman term, they differ based on the context of who that expense is being spent for. So we spoke about how we want to look at a quick difference between these expenses. As I mentioned, one of the biggest difference is the disbursement is a recoverable expense, which means that you will get back what you paid by your client in the form of an invoice payment. Now, why do you need to track them, right? If it is so that your disbursements are going to be paid by your client anyways, why do you need to track them? One of the fundamental reasons why you want to track them is if you don't, you're not understanding or assessing how much you're getting paid or how much are you recovering. Are you actually making a profit on your disbursements? Because that's a quite possibility that you may charge more for a fax, you may charge more for travel mileage, you may charge more for travel as part of your disbursements to your client. You may even charge more in terms of software that you use to render your service. So these are the types of disbursements that you may still charge your client, but you may still be able to make a profit. So tracking what you're charging your client and potentially what you're paying for it in real life is really important. And that's why it's important that you have a practice, have a method to track disbursements from the get-go, from the time you take that client in, from the time you sign up the retainer. Make sure that the rules that govern expenses, especially for your client, are well defined. We have clients, and we've heard from others in industry that, again, as there are many instances where legal professionals do make a margin on many of the disbursements and expenses they incur for their clients. There are others who are maybe true to just tracking what's being spent and charging their client exactly what that is. Regardless of your position, it's imperative that you track those disbursements and also track in real life what you paid for it. If it's the same, it's great. If it's not, then you know what that is. And how do you manage these disbursements? What are the key steps? And quick question is, do I manage disbursements out of trust, or is it better to do it through general? Okay. Now, the simplest, best answer that we've found, and we're just sharing this as feedback, the best time to record any disbursement is actually when it happened. So if there's any way you can build your methodologies or your discipline around that whole concept, it's ideal to record that disbursement when it actually happened. So tracking other aspects to that disbursement in terms of how was it paid and what was the expense for are obviously going to help justify or give you better insight when you do your reconciliation, or you have to quickly understand where these disbursements are coming from. Okay, so record the transaction when it happens, and do extend that transaction by also capturing as to how it was paid. Maybe it was paid by check, maybe it was paid through a credit card, and what was the reason behind that. Maybe it was for an application fee, maybe it was for a court fee. So defining what those are for also would give you the peace of mind. Do record the client's name and the matter that this disbursement was related to. It's really, if you're managing this through an Excel sheet, it still applies that you need to capture all of this information. If you're obviously using a software, then it's going to be a lot more easier. If you're using a legal accounting software, then that's going to be much more simplified as the weeks and months progress. Now, if you're going to be paying out of trust, where you actually get a retainer from your client, and then in the retainer agreement, you agree that the expenses or the disbursements rather are going to be taken out of trust, keeping it really simple, and then you don't have really an issue because you're just drawing off trust. But if you are paying out of general, you have to decide what portion to invoice when you send out that invoice to your client. So if you're doing a fax, you want to understand that you do a quick pre-bill, ensure that those disbursements that you incurred as part of you winning that case for your client is all covered within that invoice. Make it a habit to generate interim invoices, even if it's for disbursements. It doesn't have to be necessarily for your dockets. It's a great practice to not necessarily run invoices almost on a daily basis, but on a regular basis, so that you can keep the wheel moving, but also get your client to understand that this is a running exercise. Now, also understanding how do you spend the money and what should you record are two important questions to answer. So if in terms of the trust that we just spoke about, why not pay straight from trust, keeping it simple? So as I mentioned, to those who are not necessarily methodical in how they go about things, their focus is on other better things in terms of legal work, and maybe this is not your cup of tea, highly recommended also to keep it simple and just pay out your disbursements and expenses directly from trust. Okay, so court fee and other kind of fees that are naturally possible for you to run out of trust, rather do it through the trust. And when you pay out of your trust account, you don't have to recover the expense because that's your client's money that he gave you in advance to begin with. So it's really not your money. So it keeps it simple and it's easy to have those ledgers in. But if you're paying out of your general, whether it's your owner's pocket or whether you're paying out of your business credit card, then it's really important that you record the expense with the date so that, you want to ensure that it balances with your real life transactions, even if you're doing it for your client. And do record the amount, including the appropriate taxes. So there are certain disbursements that are tax exempt. There are others that you may want to include the tax. So really, depending on the type of disbursements that is, it's important that you capture those as you go along. Okay. Now the next question is, when do I recover those disbursement expenses, and how should I do it? When in terms of recording that disbursement before raising that invoice, as I mentioned, it's important that you record it with the information pertaining to the client, to the matter, the date, how it was paid for, etc. And if by any chance you plan on needing a markup or a markdown, it could be either ways, profit or loss, to that expense, then you have to ensure that you do that properly with the taxes included. So a great example would be using any third-party software that you may want to share the cost across clients. Okay, like a DivorceMate is a great example where you may buy a license, you may have a discounted license that you've been offered by the vendor, but you are now able to share the same expense across all clients. but then you may want to keep that profit margin because you maybe argued and won that case with that vendor for that discount. So that's the profit margin that you want to keep. You are able to do that, but it's important still that you record the expense to begin with, including the taxes that are involved. Once you disperse your client, then obviously in terms of general, you would have to raise that next invoice. Okay, raising that invoice is what's going to be allowing you to either move money from trust to general or get paid for it. Okay, so you may still have trust money, but you may plan on dispersing using your general account, in which case you raise an invoice and then you are able to transfer that eligible money from trust to general. But if it's going to be, if there's no trust involved and it's just yourself and it's a general account, maybe it's a Highway Traffic Act, and with $500 being, the overall cost of that file with expenses included, you have to ensure that you're tracking those disbursements appropriately so that you can raise the invoice at the right time. These are, again, many things that you may already know, but as we walk through, this is just a matter of reiterating what you know, and also walking you through how the uLaw software can potentially make that whole process seamless and automated. We covered a little bit of this in our previous webinar, but I think this was an important slide to talk about the types of disbursements and which ones are not trust. So there are certain components of the disbursements that you may not be able to directly get off trust. So if you look at a billable, that's straightforward. It's both trust and general. If you're doing unit rate, right? So if you're doing faxes and if you're doing other types of unit rate, scanning of photocopies, stuff like that, then it's strictly from your general. If you're doing mileage, if you're traveling from one place to another and you want to charge 40 cents per kilometer, then that's coming out of your general. If you want to charge for travel time, outside of the mileage as well, that's coming out of general. Recovery of expenses and actuals are both trust and general, and with the profit margin can only be from general. So you're not really looking to make a profit margin on a trust disbursement. Okay, so this slide is really important. As I move along, the quick point I want to make is if there are any questions, please feel free to use the chat window. I do see a few questions coming in, and so our support staff would be providing those answers as we go along. So moving along, so we talked about the types of disbursements. Now we want to talk about the types of documents that need to be reported. Now these are things that, again, you may already know. You've gone through a few audits, or you're just getting started. The bookkeeping guidelines are a very straightforward documentation that tell you the types of documents that you need to present. So let's say during an audit, your auditor or your person is looking for disbursement ledgers and journals, both from trust and general. Okay, so you want to look at those ledgers and journals for both trust and general. And if you have that both, then that's going to help you get those check boxes on your audit. A fee book with the appropriate taxes captured need to be shown as well. And we've just outlined a few samples that have been outlined by the Law Society themselves in the document. And we're also going to talk about how very similar reports can now be generated out of uLaw. But it's important from an expense perspective or from a disbursement perspective, those ledgers and journals are well managed. As I said, I wanted to cover all of that within the first 15-20 minutes about disbursements, which are, again, reiterating recoverable client expenses on a matter. And you want to ensure that by having a strong contract or a retainer letter which outlines that you will be charging for disbursements and the client would have to pay for it, whether it's within that first retainer or over and above it. Okay? So that's all with regards to a client and the expenses that you've incurred, being able to track that either using your trust money or your general money. Now we want to move on in the next 10-15 minutes talking about your business or your office expense. Okay, so this is really important. This is your other aspect of your life. And as a lot of the legal professionals today, and that's really becoming the power of the legal society, solo power of individuals becoming entrepreneurs, either individually or through an amalgamation of friends and colleagues forming small legal or law firms. Regardless, a big component of doing that or being an entrepreneur is being able to run that office, to run it as a business, and hence comes the opportunity and the need to manage expenses. The reason we've brought this slide again is because now we're going to be talking exclusively about business or office expense. Again, layman's term, expenses occurred for keeping the lights on in your law office. Okay? Now let's talk more about the office expenses. What are these types of expenses and how do you record them? Okay, so there's many types of expenses. There are certain expenses that you may not actually know yourself, but obviously there are many expenses that are very straightforward. So let's look at a few of them. Furniture. Okay, so many times, people consider furniture or initial startup costs as part of their owner's pocket, but you need to know that those are expenses that can be made part of your office expense. Stationery, right from your paper to everything else, printing and stationery is all part of that office expense that you should record. Any fees associated with being part of the law society or other groups, legal groups, those are again expenses that you are able to track and record. Obviously, your phone bills, your Rogers, Bell, who were you with, those are the phone bills that you want to capture as an expense to your office because you're on the phone, you're on the call, and those are things that you can capture and track. You've got your gas or mileage, not necessarily mileage, but your gas expense for your car, your meals, advertisements, promotions, and many more. Okay? Then you have, a rent and a property maintenance expense. So if you're actually renting a place and you're paying rent, obviously a great expense to track and record. Corporate taxes, obviously if you're paying taxes, that's an expense for the company that you're tracking. If there are bank charges and dividends, let's say there's a bank charge because you're managing, sometimes you're not, getting these payments on time and then you do have to pay for that little charge, then you track those as well. Even salaries for your office employees or contractors, anything that you're spending on behalf of your business, including salaries, is a type of expense that you should think of recording and manage. Now comes the next component, how to record them and when and what to record. Okay? When you record your expense, it's pretty much the same as when you did it for your client. You'd record it, if possible, when it happened. Okay, that's probably the best time to do it because, again, beyond a point, you're going to lose track of what you've done. And, if you have a great memory, then it's great, but many times if we forget or if we don't have the bills in our hand and we're not doing that, you may actually lose those charges. It's kind of lost in translation, if you will. So it's really important that you build a discipline about recording them when they happen. And also ensure that you capture the information in detail. Okay? Very similar to what you did with disbursements, but with little nuances here. So the date of expense, that's the same. The name and title and brief description. Okay, in the previous case, we looked at the client name and the matter name that it was associated with. But in this case, you're actually capturing what is that expense for. So this is your rent, or this is your photocopy, or this is your stationery. And uLaw allows you to define those titles and define those categories based on your business. Okay, and a little description that can help you understand what that expense was about. The type of expense, and this is again a configurable one: advertisements, stationery, rent, tax, and many such categories. You can create, you can just have a Rogers cable, Rogers phone. You can kind of split them up. You can be as innovative as possible. The actual amount. Now, the amount consists of the actual cost that you paid, includes the taxes, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the province, those taxes differ. The method of payment. So this is a really important aspect to capturing your business expense. How did you actually pay for that expense? Because if you paid it from, let's say, example, your owner's pocket, so let's say that's your money, then business actually owes you that amount. So that's a transfer that you'd have to make from the business to yourself when you pay yourself. Or if you've done it through your business credit card, or maybe you wrote a check. So it's important that you capture the method of the payment so it's easy for you to reconcile at the end of the month. Okay? And it's also important that if you've done a credit card transaction, go back to your bank account, ensure that you have that transaction number and record it. And last but not the least, who did you pay to? For whom was this expense? If it was rent, maybe you paid Mattamy. If it was for a phone expense, again, maybe one of those top telephone companies. It's really important you capture who you paid it for. And following suit, the documents that need to be maintained for office expenses. Okay, so there's the expense book. Now, the expense book obviously captures all those elements that we just spoke about: the date, the client, the description, the expense including HST or other taxes based on the province, and the total. Okay, a HST statement or HST, GST, or PST statement or payable statement. So when you actually incur expenses, if you're in Canada, you're obviously paying taxes for it, right? So if you're purchasing paper, then you're obviously paying HST. Now, that HST, combining with with the HST that you've actually collected, is something that you need to balance and manage and decide on a quarterly basis whether you pay HST back to the client, to the government, or are you waiting to receive a check from the government for the HST? Okay, so it's important that you track your taxes, your HST, GST, or PST, your expense statement, profit and loss, and even a borrowing statement. Okay, so it's important that you capture all of these documents. I believe, so for those who are logged into your computer, kindly request if you can dial into the phone. We've actually provided you with the phone number that you can dial into. I'm going to quickly, so for those who are using the computer, if your internet speed is a bit low, you may have some issues listening in. So if it's not a big deal, we'd kindly appreciate if you can dial into the phone number provided. Okay. So moving along, we spoke about disbursements, we spoke about business, and the types of documents that you manage as you go along. Okay, so this is where we left off. Now, there are other ways beyond the documents that you generate for your audits and for your, for the purposes of managing the business. There are other very proactive steps that you can take when you run your business by driving data-based decisions. And there are a lot of tools that are out there, and uLaw is one such tool that gives you the analytics behind your entire business. And it's important that you keep tab on these expenses as well as the analytics behind the scenes that crunch the data, that really give you the information on what's happening. So that information can actually reveal several things that maybe you didn't know about your business. Okay, so you probably want to know, what are my top categories of expenses? Okay, where am I spending the most? If it's a recoverable expense, then that's great because I'm going to get that money back. But if, let's say I'm spending a lot of money on the phone, and you can then compare your expenses between last month to this month to maybe last quarter, then that's a very proactive step you may want to take about reducing that phone expense, maybe looking at a different carrier. So taking the time to analyze the numbers, because numbers tell the truth, to be able to understand what your business numbers are telling you, it's important that you use some shape or form of analytics to give you that insight. Okay, so you may want to understand what type of expenses can I optimize going down. If I'm spending and not recovering my expenses, maybe that's a trend that I need to curb. Okay, so maybe I'm spending a lot of money up front, and then I'm unable to recover that because the clients are not paying for it. So that's an issue too. So the analytics with the uLaw would clearly tell you those trends so that you can then take proactive steps, making your business that much more healthier and profitable. Analytics also helps you visualize data in other forms. Again, many people are very visually aligned. It could be tabular, it could be a pie chart, or it could just be numbers. So we pretty much represent the data or the numbers in varieties of these different standards. And you want to know the unknown and plan, and again, not necessarily react to it, but then be proactive in learning what that says and take next steps. Okay, so the analytics is a big component of uLaw, but it's also a big component of what you might want to look at to be better in what you're doing. Benefits of legal accounting software. We've spoken about this many times. We blog about this all the time. It's really important as a legal professional that you understand the differences between a legal accounting software and a practice management software. We're not going to talk a lot about it today, but one of the benefits of really using legal accounting software is that it allows you to record those expenses for both your client and matter related as well as your business office expenses. Okay, so how cool would it be to just have one platform that allows you to track both those different types of expenses, but also, amalgamates the information and gives you a single source of truth. Okay, that's what we're looking towards, and that's what we're working towards. And especially if it's a HST, you want to understand the HST that you've captured or you've got from your client through those invoices. You also want to capture through those office expenses the HST that you've paid. So combining those two in one single report and telling really how much you owe or need to receive from the government, that's powerful. That's the real power of combining a single system, a legal accounting software that can combine those two aspects. Okay? And it's important that you manage and record those financial transactions and keep it as close as it is to the bank, right? In terms of reconciliation, that's really what they're trying to accomplish. They want to make sure that it's as close, or if it's not, in terms of trust, an explanation for why it is, so that you know yourself as to why it's not reconciled or balanced. But keeping those financial records as close to real life between the booking software and the bank is really important. And again, it's all about compliance, and it's all about being able to automate a lot of that work for you in today's world. I continue to say that legal tech is a growing industry, and it's a great time to be a legal professional because of all the software and tools that are available to you at your arsenal to maximize and use. And hence, please do so. Use software that can help automate a lot of these business processes rather than having to do it through an Excel sheet or a manual task. Okay. Again, for those who are visiting us the first time, we're Canadian legal accounting software. Please do visit us at our uLawPractice.com website, and we do offer a 30-day trial for your convenience. I'm going to now take the next 10 minutes to kind of walk you through all this that I've spoken about. I've been rambling away the last 35 minutes, and I want to walk you through what I mean by disbursements, what I mean by office expenses, and how do you track that in uLaw, right? So let me shift gears real quick, and I'm in my fictitious Roger Moore login. And again, we are a cloud-based, highly secure 256-bit encrypted software. So I created a matter called Joseph Chai. I already have within that matter a docket for Wilson Estate, and it's a flat rate so far for $500. So let's say I'm using this particular matter as an example of showing you how you manage disbursements. Okay, we're going to start with disbursements, and then we're going to jump into business and office expenses and how you track that. So how do you track disbursements within uLaw? You see this tab called Disbursement/Retainer, and as the name sounds, you can add a new disbursement for this client, And it's important that we capture the name, the client, the matter, and we do all of that right here. So you've got a file number, which is a unique number associated with the matter. You have a title for that particular matter. We also capture the area of practice, and this is a configurable list. So at the end of the day, we can tell you how much money you're making here, but most importantly, we can also tell you how much of money you're generally spending in this area of practice too. So that's part of your expense, right? A category of your recoverable expenses, if you will. And as you notice, we have the option to either pay that disbursement from general, or if you had a retainer in this matter, you could have potentially paid it out of trust. You can also charge miscellaneous expenses and consultancy expenses. But for the purpose of this demo, let's take a simple example of paying from general of an application fee. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to say application fee, $95, and it is tax exempt. So instead of you wanting to manage those numbers, you just click on tax exempt, and there's no tax associated with that particular disbursement. It's important that you may want to add the description. And then report that expense, right? As we mentioned, it's really important that you are able to report the expense when it happens. So let's say this happened on the 10th, it could have been on the 9th, right? You can always backdate that to ensure that you're capturing really when it happened. But then you're also telling where you're paying it to. So maybe it's the Ministry of Finance, and traditionally it's a check coming out of your general account, but there's many methods of payments that you can record. And let's just provide a check number. You're also able to print the check, so you don't have to handwrite this anymore. So you are able to print a check in uLaw, print it up to your laser printer, and there you go. Okay, so you can have 1, 2 remittances. You can have some additional description if you like. It captures the date, format. There you go. So there's a couple of things that we did with that particular disbursement for this client. Okay, so you see that disbursement being captured. It's an application fee. It's $95, tax exempt. And here's that check that you've written for the Ministry of Finance. If you place your actual check leaflet in your printer, this would emboss right on top of it. So this is the check, and here are the remittances. So all we've done now, in a matter of a minute, we added a disbursement, and we've added the $95 application fee. Okay? If you need to edit that or change it, you can always do so, but I'm not going to do that. Now let's look at another type of disbursement we spoke about. We spoke about unit rate. As you notice here, the different types are available to you here. The billable ones, mileage, unit rate, and the travel time. Okay? And we spoke about the different types of disbursements and which one would be a candidate for trust and general, right? So billable would have been a candidate for trust as well. But let me look at unit rate. Let's take a quick example of a fax, okay? Traditionally, you would, there was really not an expense with regards to a fax because you have a fax machine in your workplace and you're basically part of your retainer agreement maybe have disbursement charges that you've predefined. So in this case, this particular Roger Moore character has defined it at $1 per unit. So you could say this is a description that makes it easier for you to understand. And you put in the quantity. So now you look at when you change the disbursement type to a unit rate, automatically we're capturing the quantity. So let's say there's 100 faxes, charging him at $1 a fax, and that's what you would charge your client, the $100 plus tax. Now, let's look at an extraordinary case, or maybe a very ordinary case, where the fax machine in your office didn't work that day. Okay, for some reason the fax machine didn't work, and you had to step out on a cold, snowy day like today, and you had to go to the nearest staple, and you had to fax these 100 documents out from Staples. That would be an office expense. Okay, so the top part is a disbursement to your client, which is a recoverable expense when you invoice the client. But the bottom part is really you telling your business as to how you want to report that expense. If there is no report or expense to report, you're obviously not going to report it. You're just going to go ahead and click Save. But in my example of you needing to walk to a Staples or a Walmart to fax that, let's say you incurred, for the purposes of this demonstration, $200 that you paid Walmart or Staples for that fax. Now, in addition to paying that, you obviously paid a $26 tax. Obviously, I have this for Ontario. It will be GST or PST based on your province. So the province of Ontario, you're going to be paying 13% of tax of HST to the government. And you may actually pay this out of your cash account, owner's pocket, or you may actually pay this out of your credit card. That's why it's, I think, encouraged that you actually have a business credit card, so it's easier for you to manage those transactions. And let's say this is paid to Staples Canada, and obviously once the transaction has happened, your bank would provide you with the reference number. Okay, so there's one screen in uLaw where you not only disperse the client, but if there is a report of an expense to be done, you're able to do that. And we're going to hold that thought as to why that's really important. So when you do that, a couple of things happen. The first thing that happens is obviously you're dispersing the client, and as you see, your projected balance grows. Obviously, beyond the flat rate docket, you have a disbursement of $208, and as we say, it's an invoice pending. To get paid to recover that expense, you would raise an invoice. Okay? So it's important that you raise that invoice so that now you can track that payment, and when that payment comes, you can recover that $208 that you paid on behalf of the client. Now, what else we did there? We also did the fact we added a payment that was made to Staples, and importantly, we paid $26 of HST. Now, because we are a legal accounting software and we allow you to do those dual roles, we captured that within that same panel when it actually happened. So we enable you to tell us and report our expense when it happens. If I were to go into my tax document and look at HST and do it for this month, you are going to notice, besides the various HSTs that I've received, or this particular lawyer has received through expenses, here's that $26 that he paid that's being captured right away. That was the HST paid for this particular month of $26. So in one snapshot, we were able to capture two different pieces of information, and that's purely possible because it's a legal accounting software. Okay? So the first part was really understanding how you pay disbursements, the methods of paying that, and capturing it for a particular client and a matter, and being able to raise an invoice. So when time is ready, when you have to get paid, you can go ahead and make that payment of $773, and maybe you received a check from your client, and you can provide them a receipt. And here's that first invoice that we just generated. Obviously, there was no docket for that particular period, but if you look at the invoice, when you look at the disbursements, you have that application fee of $95 and the fax at $1 a fax. Okay, so this $208 is what was raised as an invoice to that client. And now you've given him a receipt for that $773, and you recover that expense. So that is a disbursement to a client, Mr. Joseph Chai, for an application fee as well as for fax, two different types. Now you could have done the same thing with trust as well if you had a retainer. Now let's jump with maybe another 10 or 15 minutes available. Now let's jump into the second aspect of my presentation today, which was capturing business expenses. So the same software that allows you to manage your client, your matter, your dockets, your disbursements, all related to the client. How easy would it be to also manage your own business? To do that, right under accounts, you have this action button, a very common verb across uLaw. You have action and document generation, two common verbs. Right under action, expense, because this is a full-fledged chart of accounts. If you really look at it, you have your existing accounts, all of your existing accounts that we've already preset for you, your assets, liabilities, capital, revenue, and all of your expense accounts. So it's really important that you have a look at these expense accounts before you start to use uLaw as your business accounting software or as your QuickBooks. So you could have all your salaries of your employees. If there are consultancy expenses, you can define and expand on these as well. Rent and taxes. This is just a basic list and you can always add to this. We have client expenses that are fees that are paid for clients, expenses on a client's account or other that are billed to the client. And there, here you go. Here are your office expenses. So there's a big list of potential office expense categories. These are categories that you potentially would have for an office expense, right? From stationery to bank fees, okay? And the list goes on, interest, bank charges, dividends. So we've created all these expense accounts for you. And let's look at a very simple set of office expenses that you may incur on a monthly basis. To do that, to ensure that you are able to input those office expenses into uLaw, you would come into accounts, click on action. So basically you're entering an office expense, click on office expense, and you're going to notice those different categories that we just saw, office expenses, rent and taxes, depreciation, are all available right here. If I were to look at my office expense, then I have a further definition or an expansion of different categories under those office expenses. Okay, so you have your printing and stationery, you have photocopiers. So let's maybe look a quick Rogers or Bell Canada. You know what? I don't like any of those. So let's say I'm going to create a new category. I'm just going to say add new account, which is an expense account, and it is going to be an office expense. I'm going to call this okay, very simple, phone charges. You can give it a nickname. You can call it the company that you're working for. Are you paying, sorry. And let's go back into my office expenses. And you're going to see those phone charges right come under here. Okay? If I were to pay a rent, and let me actually do a real example of a rent. Maybe there was an invoice or voucher number that your company pays you or provides you with. Just going to make up a name here. And maybe you paid $1,200, and we auto-compute your tax of $156. And you can tell us who you paid it to. Anatomy rental, coming out of your general account. Again, depending on whether you pay using a check or whether it's a credit card, and you can define what those are. Let's say you just paid through a check, print and check, and hit submit. Now what you've done is basically inputted that particular office expense. Okay, you've recorded that office expense as we just discussed during our presentation. Let's look at maybe another expense. Okay. Let's look at office supplies. Maybe you paid Staples Inc. for office supplies of $100, and you paid $13 tax, obviously, for that $100. And you paid Staples Inc., and let's say you paid it out of your business credit card. So you're now able to capture when it happens, and maybe this happened during the beginning of the month. Okay, so you can mention that too. You can say, you can backdate this to actually tell uLaw when it really happened. So you're capturing within expenses the date of when it happened, the type of expense that is. You can further categorize those expenses. Who are you paying it to? And the amount, and if there's a tax included, really depending on the tax code based on your province. And this is a snippet that allows you to then tell us the method of payment, okay, whether it's through your general or your credit card, the method of payment, and a description or a reference number, so it's easy for you to track those transactions against your bank record, right? So in a matter of the last 5 minutes, you've now been able to input immediately a couple of office expenses. You can create your own categories, but once you create them, it's as simple as adding those by using the action button, office expenses. Now this is being able to capture office expenses as and when they happen, maybe over a week, maybe within the first 10 days of your memory. Now let's say, it's one of those months where you've not been able to capture those expenses, especially the business expenses or office expenses, as and when they happened. But let's say you did have a discipline to be able to transact all those business expenses through your bank or through your credit card. Now, uLaw allows you for one more feature that allows you to import your bank statement. Okay, so let's take a quick example of how you can quickly import a bank statement or a monthly statement from your bank into uLaw, and then for you to tell at the end of the month what those expenses ideally were for. So to do that, you would go into our administrator and import our bank statement. You would choose a file. I'm just going to bring up a CSV file that I already have called my credit card statement. And you are able to download a CSV file from any of the leading banks or credit unions across Canada. And you're going to hit the upload button. Now you're going to notice magically all those expenses that you had on your bank statement, which was in that CSV format, are now all uploaded right into uLaw. So here's a phone expense. Okay, so here's Fido, here's Subway, a pizza. So you have a bunch of different types of very practical, pragmatic transactions that have happened in your general bank statement. There's even a bank fee. There's a Petro-Canada that you paid for. Now you're going to look at how uLaw measures or captures this information. So if I were to go and click Take Action, and for Fido, I'm going to say this is an office expense. Okay? And you could say it was a phone charge. And that was the amount. I'm going to go ahead and submit it. Okay? So it knows the work is done. If I were to go ahead and say Subway and call it an office expense, or let me take another example. Let me take pizza for example. If I were to go ahead and say pizza and say it's actually an office expense, uLaw tracks that it is potentially a meal expense. So it kind of has a smart dictionary that captures or reads the description of the transaction and automatically tries to associate it with its appropriate category of an expense. So it's an office expense, it's a meal expense. So this is a great way in which you can catch up if you've not done this regularly when actually the work happened. So when the expense happened, you can actually input it through your uLaw action right? You can do action and then put an office expense. But if you had a bad month and you have to do this catch up at the end of the month, you can do this method of importing your bank statement. I think we have a question about how does it know if I've already done it. So let me close out of this. So that's a really good question. So let's say you've done this, and then maybe you did this on the 15th of the month. Now at the end of the month, you're generating another statement from your bank, CIBC or TD, and then you're coming in, and now you're importing that particular file. And when you hit upload, again, uLaw tries to be smart about this. It knows that you've already imported this, okay? So it prompts you that you don't have to take action on these items, okay? So it's trying to be smart. It's trying to be very meaningful and intuitive in telling you that these are transactions that we just finished. Okay, so maybe I'll look at bank fee and call that as an office expense. And you would notice if it's a bank fee or a bank charge, we automatically make that tax exempt. So it's smart enough to know and read those descriptions of those transactions and appropriately associate it with the right category, with the right taxes. All that work is done for you automatically. Okay? How cool is that? And that's how you go about recording your expenses after the fact. So we've covered two different varieties of ways in which you can track your expenses. One is when it happens, you're able to record it, or if you have to record it at a later time, you can do that too. For a last example, just to show you the smart dictionary, let me look at Petro-Canada and then say it's an office expense. It's automatically going to add this as a gas expense. Okay? And all I'm doing is just hitting submit. That's it. Quick recap before there's a third option here. A third option is we have lawyers, we have paralegals who work with uLaw, but they love their bookkeepers, they love their accountants, and they have a comfort zone around them. You don't necessarily need to do that, but they are a great part of this ecosystem, and they have their value to provide. And let's say you work with the bookkeeper, and you've got a shoebox of bills. You could provide that too. If that's kind of really your old school way of working, we have within our expense a batch import. Giving access to your accountant or a bookkeeper uLaw is a breeze, and this is completely tab-based, so you can go about telling the date, tabbing out, saying Petro-Canada, tax exempt, the charge, and then call this as an office expense. Okay? You can just go tab, 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 and this is another way of bringing in your expenses. So uLaw provides you three different ways in which you can do that. Before we close out for today's webinar, after you've done all this work, so it's an easy capture of all the data, after you've done all of that, what are the documents that you are able to generate? So let's quickly look at your reports, under which I'm going to look at an expense report for this particular month. I'm also going to look at my expense book for this particular month. There you go. Maybe it would be a great example to show you a quarterly report, but then these are all the expenses, rent and taxes, the account type, client expenses, office expenses, and here are your total expenses as of today's date. Okay? And when you look at your expense book, it's a slightly different representation of that. The expense book for this particular law firm for this particular month talks about the date of the transaction, the client, taxes, and this is the ledger or the document that the auditor is looking for. Just to show you a quick example of how we captured all those imports, let me just go ahead and do my expense for this quarter. And here are quickly all the transactions that happened today. Okay, so you've got your phone charge. Remember, we had that $15.30. We had the meal. we had the gas expense of $60, and we also had the printing and stationery expense $560. All of that we captured directly through that bank import. It's all available right here. And we also give you a different spread of where that money is coming from. And I want to generate quickly the profit and loss for this particular quarter. It's all available, and that's how uLaw is designed. It makes it easier for you to capture your data really when it happens, or it's also got your back if you missed it to capture it when it happens. But all the reports and all the documentation and the analytics that you need to know are a quick click away. So here's a quick look at the profit and loss statement. Okay, so it has your revenue and it also has your expenses by category: rent and taxes, client expenses, as well as office expenses. So here you go. Here are all of your office expenses, again, further classified by subcategories as gas, meals, and other supplies. Before we wrap up and open the floor for any questions, we spoke about analytics. If you've done all this work and we want to quickly look at your office hygiene, you want to look at the health of your business, you have a tool now available where you can choose by client, by category. You can do your fee book, but I'm certainly interested in doing an expense chart by category. And I can do that for the month, or I can do that for the quarterly. Let me just go ahead and do my expense chart by category for this entire quarter. So you see a tabular representation. My highest for the quarter has been the expense has been rent at about $3,000. The next second expense for this quarter has been the expense on my client accounts, which is good because potentially recoverable. Then comes printing and stationery, gas expense, meals and office supplies. So just at a click of a button, you were able to understand, with the data that's already in there, a quick analytics on where are your expenses. Now you can also look at your insights with regards to the expense. So for this particular quarter, from Jan to March, I want to know what my expense statement is. I can actually do a further drill down and really have Q&A in terms of English words, which tells you, okay, what is the total expense in this period? Which category has the highest expense? So rent obviously was $2,704. And you can expand this now by looking and comparing months as well. So if you want to look at expense chart by category for this particular month, for the month of January, you can do that. Let's say you want to look at the expense book by category for the month of December, or rather for the month of February, and really compare it. You can do that too. If you really were to compare the Jan and Feb, you know that in February, actually you have, I think I'm looking at the wrong one. There you go. So you're going to have the rent still being the top category, expenses being the second, printing and stationery being the third, it's all the same. But then you have newer categories in February which you didn't have in January, which are your interest line of credit. This new particular line item, as well as your phone charges, these are two new categories that you've added into February. So maybe that's something that you need to track moving forward in terms of the expense to your business. Okay? So a quick recap, it's important that you capture your expenses, whether it's for your client, which in form of disbursements coming out of trust and or general, or capturing your business expenses. It's important that you capture it at the moment when it happens, and it's important that you use a legal accounting software to make your lives easier, to be able to provide you with the insights to run a very profitable business. Okay, so with that, I want to wrap up my webinar today and open the floors for any questions that there may be, and I'm sure there are many questions that you have, and we kindly request you to use the chat window to ask your questions. Thank you, Mark. Again, please feel free to use the chat window if you have any questions. We'll probably keep it open for the next 5 minutes. I know it is wrapping up time. Okay, a question that we have is about a HST report. We did generate that report during the demonstration. So as you capture HST, whether it's for fees or you pay HST, we capture both that information in uLaw. Right under document generation HST, you can quickly generate a quarterly report or a monthly report and download it, and it's available to you right here in the form of what we call a payable report of HST and receivable. The date range being from Jan 1st to March 31st, and it obviously tells that $653 that's owed. It captures the HST paid. It also captures the date of when that HST was paid and for what. JT282011 would be a unique file number that you can quickly search for. And these are all the legal fees for Mr. Joey Tribbiani for that particular invoice, for that particular file. And for that particular Pizza, as well as Petro-Canada bank charges that we imported from our bank statement, you can see how it's available right here. That's the Petro-Canada charge of $780 that we paid a HST. So we captured that directly from your bank statement, right? And we did the same for your Pizza you paid. It's still categorized as a meal expense, but from a HST perspective, we're able to capture the HST paid by your office for that particular transaction. So hope that answers that question. Another question that we have are the different types of banks that we support these imports from. That's a good question. I'm going to let the support staff answer that, but I believe we today handle all the major banks, so your TD Canada Trust, RBC, CIBC, BMO, so all of your major Canadian banks, we support their bank statement exports, but we also support credit unions. Some of our clients work with credit unions, and we do support them. It's important to note that you are able to export all those files as a comma-separated value file, CSV, and that's the file that we import. I've just been told that it's Meridian and Canadian Tire are also supported. Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much for participating in our webinar today. Hope this was your time well spent and an informational session. Again, continue to please send us topics that you would like us to cover in newer non-CPD sessions to make this interesting and meaningful and informational to the community. And we thank you once again for participating, and have yourself a great weekend. Thank you.